Thanks everybody for joining us today at the second Friday this month. We had last week off due to Labor Day. So we're ready today to discuss the basics of film financing with our special guest and longtime friend and board member, Dan Sartorius. Dan is an entertainment attorney, and he has represented clients in independent film and television for over 30 years. And he is also a producer, so he knows what he's talking about. We do have the Q&A box available for questions, and we'll try to address those in the time that's allotted for this live event, which is about an hour. So now, Dan, I will hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody, and I hope that we can deliver some good information for you today. Our topic is kind of introductory and relates to financing low budget productions. We're going to cover the methods of financing low micro budget independent projects, including narratives, documentaries, feature series, episodic. I'm going to start with just some general observations about financing as it relates to low budget projects, and then we'll jump into the options for financing. So we'll kind of do a quick survey, and then I'm going to drill down on certain of those options for financing. And I will try to stop periodically to take questions that arise, and we'll just charge forward. So one of the first things I want to stress is that the methods for financing independent projects is always changing. What works today might not have worked 6 months from 6 months ago, and might not work in another 6 months. So it's important to stay informed, and important to kind of keep up and keep your ears to the ground about what works and what doesn't work. Also important to know is that you have to have a diversity of financing. Independent projects are almost always financed by multiple methods, multiple sources. So in our seminar, we're going to focus kind of on what the range of projects are, and then, as I said, we'll drill down on certain ones of those. But the important thing to know is that over the life of your development of your project, you're likely to use multiple methods. Also, keep in mind that all financing is difficult. There's no easy money. Financing is where most independent projects fail. There's always more producers chasing after funding than there are available funds. Also, keep in mind that the sources of funding are very sophisticated, so you have to be sophisticated. You have to be sophisticated not only in your knowledge of financing, but also in your dealing with the financiers, and you have to be very professional and competent. Also, to keep in mind is the amount of time that it takes to develop the financing for a project is often very long, and it takes a long time to raise money. It might and often does exceed the time that it takes to produce and deliver your project. So if you want to be in the business of making independent media, then you have to think of your career as including financing and fundraising. It's a necessary skill. If by great fortune you are good at raising funding for independent projects, you will never be lonely. you'll always have the attention of the industry. So, so be in it for the long haul. Think of financing in the same way that you think of the other parts of your career in this industry, because they're all connected. Build relationships for the long run. You already know that it's important to collaborate. This is a collaborative art form, right? So you know that you need to collaborate with other creatives, but you also need to know that you want to build relationships and collaborate with business and financing partners to the same extent. Honesty is the best policy. Not only is it a legal requirement, but it is the best policy. Treat your collaborators in the same way that you'd want to be treated, and think of them as longtime collaborators. So some other kind of observations that relate to financing include that overall in the industry, budgets are shrunk. COVID has shut down productions to a large extent in our industry. Theaters are shut down, although in both situations we're seeing some comebacks in those areas. But because of the shrinking of the theatrical part of the industry, there's less being done in the large budget range. There are, of course, and this is where we'll focus on today, online platforms that are picking up the slack. A lot of productions being done in that regard. The budget sweet spots for features going on to online platforms coming from independents range probably mostly in the $2 to $3 million range, could be more, depending on talent, usually. So important for independent producers to envision their projects for online distribution. Some of our focus today will be, on financing that relates to that. Okay, maybe I'll stop for a second to see if we have any questions, and then we'll jump into more of the alternatives.
Yes, Dan, I've got a couple questions here for you. The first one being, what counts as low budget?
Okay. Well, low budget is anything from micro. So I don't know that there's a low end, but I would say these days, low budget would be that range that I was talking about, the $2 to $3 million range for features. And then for documentaries, I would say 500 to 750, 500,000 to 750,000. Although, depending on the type of project, type of documentary it is, it could be much lower, and of course it could be much higher.
Okay, do you want a couple more questions right off the bat here?
Yep.
Okay, is it worthwhile to try to finance for a short film since there doesn't seem to be much of a market for shorts?
Yeah, I would say short films, single, separate formed short form, whether it's documentary or short narratives, there isn't much of a market for those. Of course, if you're doing episodics and they're somehow serially related, there might be an audience and a market for that. But yeah, short films are difficult.
And then one more question that is coming from a couple of people. Are there good resources or websites or gatherings to keep up to date on changes in independent financing, or to learn the sources, the magical sources of independent financing?
I didn't kind of prepare to give you some sources for that. I think D-Word is a good source for documentaries off the top of my head. Sorry, I'm not coming up with anything for features. I mean, certainly Film North, IFP in LA, or actually in New York, Film Independent. These are good sources for that sort of information, but sorry, I didn't have prepare that list.
That's okay. Maybe we can come up with some of those and list them and send them out later.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let's just look at some of the options for funding independent projects. And a lot of these will be known to our participants today, and some of them may be new to them. So some of the most active sources of financing come from the online platforms, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu. And if we get a chance, and if people are interested, maybe we can talk briefly about sales agents as they relate to connecting to those platforms. Co-productions, especially other production companies that have prior and ongoing relationships with online platforms. If you can identify those and interest those companies, that's a good source of financing. Of course, state incentives, depending on the state, are an important component, and we'll talk briefly about that later if there's time. Other viable but maybe less active sources would be international co-productions, crowdfunding, always an evergreen option, although not a substantial contributor to in terms of the amount of money. Private equity is still viable, has been maybe from the beginning of producing independent projects. So we'll talk about that. Independent financiers, I'll get into that a little bit. If you have a pre-sale of some sort where there's a gap that can be financed, there are financiers who may be able to help in that regard. They're hard to find, but some have come and gone over the years. We'll talk a little bit about supplier deferrals. Basically, this is where people who are your partners in quotes on the project, like talent, actors, that is, crew, equipment suppliers, editing facilities. Sometimes agreements can be made with them in which they defer part or all of their fees, and that can be a means of financing. Of course, grants, and I won't speak to grants. That's probably best for a different seminar, but that's a source of funding to develop, particularly in the development phase of projects. Other sources that are pretty much dormant, financing from studios has been a source of for independent productions, but not a current, as far as I can tell, option. Distributor pre-sales, which have been over the years often a very helpful tool in financing independent work. Distributor pre-sales are shrinking, sometimes non-existent, depending on the project. And we'll talk about packaging in a second, and packages are often what attract distributor pre-sales. Wildcard sources of financing for the independent include things like sponsorships, product placement, branded entertainment. These are situations where corporations or manufacturers provide financial or product support to a project in exchange for promoting their products or services. This tends to be very specific to a certain type of project, and it's going to be possible option for some projects, but not for many projects. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk about what a package is and the elements in the package, because that's a very important threshold consideration for financing. So I've broken this down into kind of creative elements that go into a package and business elements that go into a package. And a lot of these are known to people who are online watching today, our other participants. So I'm just going to kind of click through them. Some of them merit a little bit more description than others. Certainly the script or the underlying material, it might be a series Bible or summaries. That's important. What's really important also is the underlying rights. So if your project is based on a book or an article, then it's a book or article that had some success in the marketplace, notoriety, then you want to tout that. And you'll also, very, very important, you want to have a good agreement to tie up those rights, whether it's an option or you own it or outright or whatever. So also, if the story is, or the documentary or narrative story is based on someone's life story, you want to have a great agreement that covers and protects you, and that needs to be described in your package. I can't emphasize this enough. This is in lots of situations, the independent producers leverage as they go to, whether it's co-producers or financiers or distributors. This is what keeps the independent producer in the game. It gives them leverage in negotiations and allows you to maybe maintain some creative control, that sort of thing. So important. Other presentation materials, sometimes there's trailers for documentaries or narratives. There might be extensive footage that you can, if it's for a documentary, essential footage about the topic that you've already taken and control. Sometimes even a pilot is being made. Very risky, not always advisable. A lookbook is also great for presentational materials. Maybe the most important thing, particularly for a narrative, not so much for a documentary, but a really critical part of a package is the talent. Getting the talent attached makes or breaks most narrative projects. It affects how you can raise funds for the project. Now the talent knows this, the talent agents know this, and they often will not allow an attachment to a project until there is funding. So there's a catch-22 chicken and egg problem here that needs to be solved, and it's often not easily solved, but it's part of the game. It's part of the independent producer game, and we can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. But just to move on, if there's personnel associated with the project, like a director that is well known, that's an important part of the project. If other contributors, creative contributors, have name recognition like writers, that's important. You want to have a director's statement or something of the like about the creative treatment of the material. For business elements in a package, certainly the budget's important, or at least a number that's based on a real budget by a real line producer. A description of the audience and the demographics, and so those sorts of financing, how are you going to finance this, what your plans are, including some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So that's a package. That's really important. And I think I'll, again, stop here and see if we have questions that need to be addressed.
Sure, there's just a general question is to whether what you're talking about can also apply to independent television series as well.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't, maybe I should have started out with that. So all these factors, financing factors, apply to television, to other episodic work, to features, to documentaries. Obviously, there might be different twists, and different emphasis, but yeah, all these are available to producers of television as well. Okay, so let's start in on what the options are, and some of these options are financing available outside of the industry. Some are available within the industry. We're going to start with equity financing, and we'll move on to crowdfunding and deferrals, and a mention of state incentives. And then we'll move on to the inside of the industry options. So equity financing. So this is, as I've said prior, this is a evergreen source of financing. It tends to be relationship based. Lots of times for independent projects, equity financing is based on who you know, wealthy people you know, or syndicates of wealthy people who you might have an association with. And what it is basically is raising financing from investors. Those people who, or companies who participate in the upside, if there is one, and who are taking the risk that there might be a downside, which there often is. Investors are usually owners in the company, so they might own shares of stock if it's a corporation, or they might own membership interests if it's a limited liability company, an LLC. Usually equity is not a loan. It can be structured as a loan, but generally speaking, it's not technically a loan, but loans can be considered securities, just like shares of stock or membership interests. All can be considered securities for the purposes of regulations. Once again, if the company doesn't make money, usually equity is not paid back. Rather, instead, the investors take a loss. So consequently, this is high risk and highly regulated by state and federal governments. So the general rule from regulating securities standpoint is that you have to be registered to sell securities, or you have to have an exemption from registration. And that's where independents live, is finding the right exemption from registration. Registration is an expensive process and would really not be viable financially for independents, especially one-up productions. So investors also sorry, let me start again here. So as I said before, the companies who are offering to sell securities have to comply with state and federal law. And that requires a lawyer with knowledge and experience in securities laws. Really important. It's like, you wouldn't want to do, open heart surgery on yourself. You wouldn't want to try to issue securities on your own. Any arrangement that includes a passive investor is probably subject to the securities laws. So a passive investor is, once again, someone who's coming along for the ride, who participates in the upside. If there's upside, they take the risk of the loss. If there's a downside, but they're not actively involved in the business of running the company. So if you have all active investors, like yourself, like if you're putting money in, then that's less involved in securities laws than if you're taking on passive investors. And passive investors want to be passive because it limits their liability. So it's, once again, I'm just going to emphasize that it's illegal to sell securities unless it's subject to a registration statement filed with the SEC, or you have an exemption. And failure to comply with the law, including finding an exemption, creates substantial liability, including criminal liability. Selling securities without either registering or qualifying for an exemption is a felony. Also, injured parties, investors, can bring civil actions against issuers. So the game is, finding an exemption, and there are good exemptions that qualify for a use in independent productions. The thing to keep in mind, however, is that even if you comply with all the laws, state and federal laws, you are still subject to claims of fraud. That's one, if you commit fraud, finding an exemption, some safe harbor exemption, is not going to let you off the hook. So that's why we want to avoid claims of fraud, obviously. So that's why we have such extensive documentation. These are offering memorandums or private placement memorandums. And they're extensive, and consequently they're expensive. But you need them for disclosures, particularly the disclosure of the risk of the investment. Okay, so I think maybe we've beaten up this issue of private equity, although maybe this will be another good time to take questions.
I've just got one for you right now. What about creating an LLC and having investors own percentages of the LLC?
Yep. Okay, perfect. Actually, that leads me right into my next topic. So business structures. What kind of company do you form? So we usually structure for our clients a two-company system for a production. So it's each of these two companies are formed just for that particular production. So the one company that's formed is the company that's responsible for production, and we'll call it the production company. It's the company that hires and fires people, enters into contracts with suppliers, talent, etc. And it is there to manage the liabilities that can happen. someone gets injured on the set or whatever, and we want to protect the investors and the rights in the property. We want to protect them that from the liabilities of production. So usually the production company that I just described is a corporation, and it exists only to produce this one film or television program or whatever production. Then there's the financing company, which is the company that lives for a long time. It owns all the rights, and any rights that the production company owns would be automatically transferred to the financing company under a work for hire agreement. The financing company is where the investors live. It's where the rights in the property live. And it has creative and business control over the project, and et cetera. So getting back to that question, so yes, the LLC would be the entity that the investors invest in. So they co-own, they're part owners in what I've described as the financing company. Now, we had a question before earlier from Jennifer, which was what to look out for when selling a film to a network that is currently an LLC with investors owning percentages of the film. So I think this question helps us understand a little bit about the points I'm trying to make about how to structure your companies for the purpose of financing your production. So investors in a project get a percentage according to a formula, sometimes called the waterfall. And this is usually in the form of a written agreement, like an extensive agreement, often called a control agreement or an operating agreement. If the entity is an S corporation, then that entity, then the shareholders, because it's a corporation, they get paid according to the number of shares they own. If the company is a limited liability company, an LLC, we have greater flexibility in structuring the waterfall. So for example, we might want to, and investors often require this, we might want to get the investors paid back first from revenues to the company, and then maybe even give them an additional percentage for a return on their investment before splitting with the investors. So the investors provide the financing to create the work, and then we have the filmmaker or the producer or the creatives who are making the project. So after the investors get paid back their investment plus a bump of some sort, then there's a split, oftentimes 50-50, but it doesn't have to be 50-50. It's a contractual matter that gets negotiated. So as I said, getting back to Jennifer's question, the investors get paid a percentage of the revenue that's earned from the sale to the network. Presumably, this company that's selling to the network is a single purpose entity, just formed for that production, which is what we usually recommend. If not, if it's a company that's been used for multiple productions, then those investors would be entitled to share in revenues from all the productions, even if they didn't supply funding for those other productions. So you want to be thoughtful about how you structure that. Also, there's a control issue. Usually the LLC agreement gives, as I said, control to the producer parties. But if you haven't provided for that, then those other investors might have a right to approve the deal with the network, which might be okay, or it might muck up the works. So anyhow, those are some things to keep in mind, in response to Jennifer's question.
Dan, can you just make a quick clarification? What type of company is the production company? How is that structured versus the financing company? Are they both LLCs? Is one an S Corp? That sort of thing. Could you just clarify that, please?
Yeah, I would say the production company, the company who's undertaking that actual work, should be a corporation, could be an LLC. That's not really critical because it doesn't exist for very long, and it's usually just owned by the financing company, no other owners. So whatever it is, LLC or corporation, I would suggest a corporation, you want it to have limited liability. So that's why we choose one of those two forms. The financing company should, I shouldn't know, should is not the right word, but there's many advantages to having it be an LLC. So the ones that I spoke about, which is control, the ability to be flexible in rewarding the investors, that sort of thing. So.
Thank you. So I just want to note that we have about 20 minutes left.
Okay.
So choose your next topics accordingly.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not moving through my outline as fast as I thought I would. So I just want to touch on quickly on crowdfunding. It is very viable. It's been around about 10 years. The advantages of crowdfunding is that you don't have to repay your donor. It's a contribution and not a loan if properly structured. Also, if you make arrangements, it can be tax deductible to your donor, so there's an incentive there. Crowdfunding is pretty much available to anyone. It gives producers a lot of latitude about how they can use the funds. And there's some subjective benefits to crowdfunding, like it creates a fan base. People are invested in your project. Disadvantages, it's a lot of work. Ask anybody who's done one. The vast majority of the projects that use crowdfunding only raise $25,000 or less. There's some exceptions, but it's not a big contributor to the financing of a film. Also, there's some risks which should be mentioned, including, that if you're promising to deliver T-shirts or copies of the film or whatever, you have to do that. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to fraud claims. Okay, fiscal sponsorships. A fiscal sponsor is someone a company, a nonprofit who is a 501c3. Working with a fiscal sponsor enables the donor's donation to be a tax-deductible gift. So they get that treatment on their tax returns. So that's the advantage. The disadvantages are that there's usually a fee, and also you should know that IRS is becoming more and more concerned about these transactions, and they've taken an active role in scrutinizing these deals. So you can have both donations, so crowdfunding, and investments, for example, equity financing in the same project. I'm going to talk a little bit about deferrals. Again, this is an arrangement between the production company and individuals who are supplying services or materials to the production. These agreements usually provide for the supplier of the goods or services to be paid for a below market small payment up front, sometimes no payment, but a small payment up front in exchange for larger payments down the road, usually on a speculative basis. So actors, writers, directors, producers, nearly anybody who's supplying services or materials to production could be structured into a deferral deal. Usually, in terms of payment, for the deferred fee, it could be paid out of the financing of the project, meaning once the money is raised for the budget, then they're paid that additional amount, whatever it is. It could also, the deferral payment could come from the exploitation of the rights in the production. So advances from the sale once there's a delivery to the distributor, or ongoing receipts from the exploitations like royalties from distribution or whatever. This puts the deferral participants at risk, and so there's a risk reward analysis and a negotiation. I want to be careful to also advise that this brings in the issue of classifying workers as either independent contractors or employees. Misclassification is something that the IRS and the state taxing authorities are very interested in and can be very scrutinizing. It's a subject for another seminar, but you need to keep it in mind, particularly because there is a IRS code, section 409, which governs deferred compensation to independent contractors. And that could be subject to penalties if you don't comply with the documentation and payments, if there's payments to be made from a tax standpoint. Okay, government incentives. I won't go into detail on, this is state and state, no federal. This is tax credits, tax rebates, other incentives that states provide to encourage production companies to produce in their states. And as I said, I won't go into detail on this, but just a quick observation or two. This is always an essential part of any financing plan for a production. Investors and financiers are very interested in whether and to the extent that state incentives are available. So that's important. Also, you always want to keep in mind the monetization of tax incentives. Tax incentives do not mature until the production is finished, the paperwork is filed and approved. So lots of times independent producers need their money earlier than that to finance their project. So you need to keep in mind what needs to be done to monetize that. Oftentimes we work with brokers who buy tax credits at a discounted price. We want to make sure the tax credits are transferable when possible. So important to keep in mind the monetization of the tax incentives. So jumping into co-productions. I'm going to focus. Oh, do we have?
There's a couple of questions if you have a minute.
Okay.
2 questions about deferrals. One is, do you know anyone who's had that's gotten a deferral payment? And does your firm offer deferral services?
Well, I don't know that I can commit one way or another in terms of whether my firm would work on a deferral basis. I can't say that I've never done that, but it's, you know, like any business, I have to be very, very careful on that. And yes, you know, it's a common practice in the industry, and sometimes it happens by accident or not by plan. That is, you know, we get down the road and funds are not available, and so you have to convert from what might have been an expectation of pay as you go to some sort of deferral. Is that all those questions? Okay.
There's Dan, there's one more here that doesn't relate directly to deferrals. I don't think. I was just going to type back to the person asking the question to see if they could clarify. But the question just says, what about SAG after low budget contracts? And I'm not sure if that's in relation to deferrals or not. So if that person would like to clarify in the Q&A, please let me know.
So if you're working under a union agreement, so SAG after, then you obviously have to comply with those rules and the payments and everything else involved in those contracts. It is possible, and especially with talent that has the ability to bring, you know, bring audience to the film. It's quite possible that you would give them some incentives. You can call that a deferral, but in a sense, it's not a deferral because they're getting their fee under the contract. So you're paying them what's required, the minimums required under the union contract, but might not be enough for them. They might want to be paid much more, and oftentimes they deserve to be paid much more. And those can be paid out of revenues from the project. So they can be paid in terms of bonuses if the production in distribution reaches certain goals. They can be paid as part of the back end, like net points, net profits, whatever you want to call them. And technically, I guess those could be defined as deferrals, but we usually think of those differently. We usually just think of them as additional incentives to talent. Oh, you've muted yourself.
With 10 minutes left, can you hear me now? With 10 minutes left to go, do you have a final, most important financing tip?
I think my most important tips were kind of laid out at the beginning in terms of advice. I don't have additional most important tips. You know, certainly keep good records, keep your paperwork in shape, get good advice, follow the good advice. Yeah, I think those are the points that I would make. I want to spend a little bit of time on co-productions because those are a good, and my last point in my outline. So co-productions, I think we all understand what that arrangement is. That you're working with another production company, maybe because they have a great relationship with an online platform or a distributor. Those agreements with the co-production partners are obviously critical and important. in those agreements, they will acquire certain rights. Oftentimes, those rights involve the right to control distribution, broadcast rights, that sort of thing. They may have a portion of the ownership in the project. We talked a little bit earlier about your negotiating powers in preserving your rights in terms of control, ownership. So I don't need to touch on those again. And just cutting back on what I was going to say here, I just want to go back and emphasize that if you control rights, in terms of, you have book rights that you've tied up, life story rights that you've tied up, you have invaluable, essential footage that, in terms of perhaps a documentary, you have that footage already in the can and control it and control the rights in it. That puts you in a much better bargaining position. Same is true with controlling talent. If you have talent that you control, an actor that is well known, and you have an agreement with them and can bring that to the party, that's really great. And if you have a track record of and experience in producing and delivering productions of this type, that also puts you in a good position to negotiate. Lot more to talk about, but I think we've covered a lot of the bases.
There's a question hanging out here, if you're willing for one more. Do you think that a documentary about fraudulent guardianships would meet a great deal of legal loopholes?
Well, this is not a financing issue, but it's something I deal with a lot. So, obviously I would need to know a lot more about how, what issues, what liabilities are involved. But it suggests to me that, there are right of privacy issues. There are potentially, if there's an adversarial relationship, there's potential defamation, libel issues. You would want to think through the life story rights issues and get signed agreements with the people involved. Yeah, I mean, it's, and ultimately you're going to be required to, as part of your deliverables, once the documentary is made and you're ready to deliver it to the distributor, broadcaster, whomever, you're going to have E&O insurance, errors and omission insurance, to cover for these publication torts. So like slander, libel, right of privacy, right of publicity, copyright infringement, trademark infringement, all those sorts of rights, those are covered by E&O insurance. And the E&O insurance carrier is going to require you to jump through all these hoops to make sure you've tied up all these rights through agreements, or if it's a copyright issue and you have some sort of fair use rights to use the material. So yeah, I would say I don't remember exactly how the question was phrased, but there are a lot of rights clearance issues that you'll need to address when making a documentary of that sort.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for sharing your knowledge today. I know that there were some resources that we said we would maybe pull together. I'll talk to you offline.
Great.
I wanted to thank everybody for joining us and thank Dan for his time today. Stay tuned for next month. We will be back to the first Friday of the month on October 2nd, I believe. And we'll be announcing that topic as soon as we are 100% confirmed, and we will put something out in the next week or so. So thanks everybody for being here. We appreciate your time.
Everybody. Yep, it was
and
fun.
everybody stay home and stay safe.